Hello, everyone, and welcome again to The Truth About Psychiatry. This is episode 7, and I like to call this episode Psychiatry, Celebrities, and SSRI Stories. And we'll find out what that means in a moment. Um, First, I'd like to review our last video. We talked a lot about Thomas Szasz and Bonnie Burstow. We mentioned several books that I'd like to remind you about, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about some of those books in the future. In this episode on the truth about psychiatry, I will also discuss some of the stories that have been in the news over the years and some of the celebrities who can help us to understand the truth about psychiatry. I also have a couple of my own creative works that I'd like to share, including an essay that I submitted to Mad in America, but it was rejected because it told the truth too plainly. Then I also have a poem that I wrote that I want to share. So then after that, perhaps next time we'll get more into Thomas Szasz' book on schizophrenia, the sacred symbol of psychiatry. And I also like to talk more about a few more antipsychiatrists that I've discovered. But just to start out with a review of the last video, we did talk about a book by Thomas Szasz called Antipsychiatry, Quackery Squared. And this is the book here. It's actually a very good book. And just wanted to review a little bit of what I've written about it on my blog under the title Antipsychiatry, Quackery Squared. You can look it up on my blog, psychiatricsurvivors.wordpress.com, and it's in the Truth About Psychiatry compilation of blog posts. Thomas Szasz was a genius. Like most geniuses, his work has been widely misunderstood, casually dismissed, and even vehemently opposed. Purveyors of what Szasz called the therapeutic state have failed to understand the simplicity of his basic thesis, namely that psychiatry and antipsychiatry are unjust because they are based on coercion and lies. So, and remember that this type of antipsychiatry is the kind that Thomas Szasz opposed during his earlier in his career, and that had to do with people like R.D. Laing, who wrote The Divided Self. He wrote other books, I'm sure, but Laing was one of the popularizers of the anti-psychiatry movement during Szasz's early career, and that is the type of anti-psychiatry that Szasz was opposing. The anti-psychiatry of today is a different thing that Szasz most likely would have supported. So that's Laing and Thomas Szasz on anti-psychiatry, the early anti-psychiatry. Advocates of psychiatry and anti-psychiatry alike have failed to understand that Szasz was correct to assert that individual liberty and responsibility constitute the core of a just society. Like most geniuses, Szasz was light years ahead of his time. Although his work was rooted in common sense, it continues to extend light years ahead of the status quo. So, one thing I'd like to point out here is Thomas Szasz was a great proponent of liberty and responsibility. He saw liberty and responsibility as two sides of the same coin, and although he probably emphasizes liberty with too much of a libertarian streak, I think he's absolutely correct to promote liberty and responsibility as two sides of the same coin. Um, so in this blog post, I continue. Nowhere is Szasz' brilliance more evident than in his book Antipsychiatry, Quackery Squared. The clarity of his ideas sparkles more brightly in contrast to the dark background of his critics and detractors. Long ago, Szasz demonstrated that the notion of mental illness is a metaphor and a myth, not a medical reality. He showed how the insanity defense, psychiatric incarceration, and forced drugging are antithetical to anything worthy of being called medicine or healing. Even though Szasz effectively exposed the brutality of psychiatry, the anti-psychiatry movement of the 60s began to undermine his efforts. So this is the anti-psychiatry movement. This is why Szasz thinks psychiatry is quackery, and anti-psychiatry, this early anti-psychiatry, is Quackery Squared, because it's just another form, double quackery, Quackery Squared, of psychiatry. Led by the immoral renegade psychiatrist R.D. Laing, this guy, the divided self, the so-called anti-psychiatry movement perpetuated the abuses and injustices of psychiatry under another name. Laing's antics stymied critics of psychiatry by subsuming their work under the rubric of anti-psychiatry. But Szasz's book, Antipsychiatry, Quackery Squared, unmasked Laing and his cohorts for what they were, con artists and charlatans like Charcot and Freud before them. Although he was often smeared as an anti-psychiatrist, Szasz showed that since psychiatry is quackery, anti-psychiatry is nothing more than Quackery Squared. He was equally opposed to psychiatry and anti-psychiatry because both movements depend upon pseudoscientific dogmas and coercive practices. Szasz was decidedly pro-liberty and pro-responsibility, something that his critics found intolerable. In the preface to his book, The Age of Madness, Szasz compared institutional psychiatry to slavery. Quote, like slavery, institutional psychiatry is a complex social-economic phenomenon of long-standing and great practical importance. For millennia, slavery flourished. While it did, the greatest minds sincerely believed that slavery was a boon not only for the master, but also for the slave. I would correct that and say some of the greatest minds, but not the greatest minds. Only recently did the people of the Western world feel ready to abolish this institution and replace it with labor relations based on contract. In comparison, hospital psychiatry is a young institution. Indeed, it seems probable that it is still in the ascendancy, and that it will grow and flourish before mankind will feel morally moved and socially prepared to replace it, too, with patterns of social welfare based on mutual consent. So Szasz clearly is comparing psychiatry to slavery, and he sees at the time of writing this book, which was earlier on in his career, that he thought that psychiatry was still a burgeoning new institution that would take a long time to abolish, just like slavery took a long time to abolish. Dr. Thomas Szasz was morally moved and socially prepared to abolish coercive psychiatry many decades ago. A few voices in the wilderness, including Robert Whitaker, Dr. Peter Breggin, Anne Blake Tracy, and survivors of psychiatric abuse, are preparing the rest of the world for this move. When coercive psychiatry and so-called anti-psychiatry are finally abolished, future generations will commemorate Szasz's work just as current generations venerate Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Until that time, as Szasz predicted, we will continue to witness the terrible consequences of coercive psychiatry. So maybe it's a slight exaggeration to compare Szasz to Lincoln. It's actually an exaggeration, but I do believe that once psychiatry is abolished, that many will have Thomas Szasz to thank for that advancement in liberty and advancement of everything that has to do with freedom and responsibility. So that's a little bit about Thomas Szasz on anti-psychiatry, Quackery Squared, and just keep in mind that that was the anti-psychiatry of Laing that Thomas Szasz opposed, and that a new anti-psychiatry movement has since emerged that is also leans towards abolition, the abolition of psychiatry. So, so some of the other books that we mentioned last time, I'd just like to show you. So in the last video, I mentioned Thomas Szasz, Szasz Under Fire, The Psychiatric Abolitionist Faces His Critics. I mentioned this book. Hopefully, we'll be able to discuss it later. It's a series of essays of Szasz's critics and his responses to his critics. And I mentioned Coercion as Cure, A Critical History of Psychiatry. I mentioned Psychiatric Slavery. This is Szasz explicitly compares psychiatry to chattel slavery, and it's an excellent book. Hopefully, we'll have a video to discuss that. Another similar book, Liberation by Oppression, A Comparative Study of Slavery and Psychiatry, another explicit comparison between slavery in the South and psychiatry. I did mention one of my favorite books by Thomas Szasz is Anti-Freud, Karl Kraus's Criticism of Psychoanalysis and Psychiatry. This is a very important book in my estimation because Thomas Szasz derived a lot of his ideas from Karl Kraus, who, as I mentioned in a previous video, understood already from the inception, already from the time of Freud and his contemporaries, that psychiatry was bunk. So Karl Kraus is an important author who was mostly given the silent treatment, but Szasz has revived his work, and I'm trying to revive Szasz's work so more people know who he is and also understand him better, because most people don't even know who he is or who he was, and even those who know who he was usually don't really understand what he was writing about or why he made such claims. Another book, The Myth of Psychotherapy, we discussed. So this kind of goes hand in hand with The Myth of Mental Illness. Szasz was also critical. He wasn't just critical of what is commonly called biological psychiatry or the medical model psychiatry. He was also critical of psychotherapy, even though he was a so-called psychotherapist. He shows that that there are problems with even that, which is not to suggest that talking with people or having counseling is necessarily a bad thing. But if you read this book, I think you'll better understand why psychotherapy is. There's really not very much science to it, and it has a lot more to do with, well, let's just say that it's a very creative enterprise. We'll talk about that another time. Another book we discussed is Thomas Szasz on the Therapeutic State, and that's a great book. And as I mentioned, I think that we're seeing more and more how we live under the dominion of the therapeutic state, especially during this Wuhan coronavirus time, this pandemic, that it's showing us more and more what kind of therapeutic state we find ourselves in. So I mentioned all of those books. I also mentioned Foucault, his Madness and Civilization, and how Bonnie Burstow rightly criticizes Foucault, although she also pulls out some interesting themes that are worth discussing. And then I mentioned Joanna Moncrief. Bonnie Burstow mentions Joanna Moncrief. She wrote a book called The Bitterest Pills, and she's a tough nut to crack. I feel like she publishes frequently on Mad in America. She's quite philosophically sophisticated, smart lady, and she's written this book is very good on the history of psychopharmacology, pharmaceutical industry, psychotropic drugs. So she recognizes all the things that Whitaker and Bregan and Szasz and Burstow recognizes, but for some reason, and maybe because she's a psychiatrist, she continues to cling to a lot of the false notions of psychiatry, which is unfortunate. Um, so those are some of the books I mentioned in our last session. I just wanted to remind you about them. Um, and while I have it here, and I might as well reiterate this, remember that it is dangerous to withdraw from psychotropic drugs rapidly. You cannot do it cold turkey. You must do it gradually, tapering very slowly if you decide to go off the drugs. And there are books. Peter Breggin has written an excellent book on how to do that safely. This is another book that I found, How to Get Off Psychoactive Drugs Safely. There is Hope, There is a Solution by James Harper and Jason Austin. I've only skimmed through this book, so I don't know how good it is. It's probably not as good as Peter Breggin's book on the same topic. But it could be helpful because there's just so much that people don't know about psychotropic drugs. Not just the victims of drugging themselves, but also those who are prescribing them. Most often, they know next to nothing about what these drugs are or what they do, or what the effects of the drugs are. There's also a website that was started by a lady who's a survivor, a psychiatric survivor. Her name is Laura Delano, Delano, and she has started a company or a group, an organization called Inner Compass Initiative, I believe it's called. So Laura, Laura, Delano, Delano, Inner Compass Initiative, and her whole focus is to help people to withdraw from psychotropic drugs and to extricate themselves from the trap of psychiatry. And so there's some helpful resources out there. As I mentioned in a previous video, Jim Gottstein is also a lawyer who apparently has helped some people. But in my search, it's been very difficult to find any lawyers who are remotely acquainted with the pharmaceutical industry or helping survivors of psychiatry. It's just the legal system. Maybe there's people out there, but they've been so hard to find, and it's really, the system is set up to harm, quote unquote, patients of psychiatry. But then once they're harmed and their lives are ruined, there's not really anything in place except for what I mentioned of Laura's Inner Compass Initiative. There's not much in place to really assist these people who have, if they've survived, like if they haven't died, they're suffering immensely. So it's a really terrible thing, and I would hope that in the future there would be more resources to support survivors of psychiatry. So those are a few books and a few things that might be helpful to you or your loved ones or your friends or anyone who has been a victim of psychiatry. So now, let's see, what did I want to talk about next? So I talked about that. Well, we've talked a lot about psychiatry and anti-psychiatry. What is anti-psychiatry? But let me read to you an essay that I wrote. This is an essay that I submitted to Mad in America for publication. Robert Whitaker rejected it, and at first I wanted to submit it under a pseudonym, pen name, because at the time I wasn't ready to just write so openly about the truth about psychiatry. But now that it's been rejected, and in my view, it was rejected because because I speak the truth too plainly about psychiatry, that and Robert Whitaker in his website is, he's trying to he's trying to appease both sides. Basically, he's a reformer, or at least the last that I've known, he was a critic of psychiatry and one of the greatest. And I'm very grateful for the work that he's done and that he continues to do. So a great ally of survivors, but he's also trying to persuade the proponents of psychiatry with the mentality of a reformer or mentality of a critic rather than someone like Bonnie Burstow, Thomas Szasz, who are abolitionists who see there's nothing that's going to reform psychiatry. It's as I mentioned in a previous video, it's much worse than a pile of manure. And a pile of manure is useful for things, whereas psychiatry is harmful and creates terrible problems in our society. So let me just read this essay that I wrote that was rejected. It is called "What is Psychiatry?" This essay was submitted for publication with Mad in America and rejected by Robert Whitaker. What is psychiatry? The American Psychiatric Association defines psychiatry as, quote, the branch of medicine focused on the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders, unquote. Psychiatrist, so the APA claims, is, quote, a medical doctor, an MD or a DO who specializes in mental health, including substance use disorders, and psychiatrists are qualified to assess both the mental and physical aspects of psychological problems, unquote. On its surface, such definitions appear rational. However, upon deeper inspection, nothing could be further from the truth. The word psychiatry, and I've mentioned this in a previous video, is derived from the ancient Greek term psyche, meaning soul, and iatrikos, meaning medical treatment. Thus, psychiatry refers to the medical treatment of the soul. Is this what the APA claims to accomplish? Do psychiatrists treat the human soul with medicine? For a psychiatrist to treat the human soul with medicine would first require that he or she possesses knowledge concerning the human soul. It would also require that he or she possess knowledge concerning medicines that treat the human soul. Do psychiatrists possess knowledge of either of these things? Of course not. To borrow a phrase from the brilliant Thomas Szasz, psychiatry is and always has been the science of lies. So Thomas Szasz has a whole book called Psychiatry, the Science of Lies, and it is one of the best. I know I've said this about a lot of Thomas Szasz's books, but it's one of the best summaries of the history of psychiatry and one of the best exposés of the truth about psychiatry. There is nothing remotely scientific or rational about psychiatry, and yet it poses as a medical profession with the authority to diagnose, treat, and prevent mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. From whence this authority? From whence this capacity to assess both the purported mental and physical aspects of psychological problems? Even if the authority of psychiatry were legitimate, which it is not, what could it possibly mean for a psychiatrist to provide medical treatment for the human soul? What are the disorders or problems that psychiatry claims to confront? What is mental illness? To borrow another phrase from the inimitable Thomas Szasz, mental illness is a myth. Simply put, there is no such thing as mental illness. The alleged psychological problems and behavioral disorders that fall under the umbrella of mental illness are little more than the inventions of a group of sick-minded psychiatrists. This is not to claim that human beings do not suffer from a wide variety of afflictions or debilitating symptoms. Quite the contrary. But the notion that the endless variety of human suffering is somehow reducible to mental illness, and that psychiatrists have a special knowledge of mental illness, is more than egregiously false. It is a hoax of catastrophic proportions. What then is psychiatry? Psychiatry is the pseudoscientific justification for slavery, abuse, torture, involuntary incarceration, forced drugging, ostracism, stigmatization, electroshock, lobotomy, and murder. As Szasz clearly understood, psychiatry is rationalized coercion and state-sponsored violence. It is institutionalized opposition to liberty and responsibility. How can this be? How is it possible for supposed experts in what is ostensibly a branch of medicine inflict so much harm on so many innocent people? Furthermore, why would anyone perpetrate such horrendous crimes. C.S. Lewis explains. So this is the quote that I shared in the last video, but it's worth repeating again because it is so relevant to the work of psychiatry. Quote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will, and cured of states which we may not regard as disease, is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classified with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals." Unquote. When pharmaceutical robber barons team up with omnipotent moral busybodies, and when government bureaucracies lend their support, the result is that which the relentless Thomas Szasz aptly named the therapeutic state. Psychiatry is a tyrannical arm of the therapeutic state that subjects citizens to its unholy dominion. In the guise of a medical profession, psychiatry reduces its victims to docile and defenseless vassals of the therapeutic state. If this is what is meant by the medical treatment of the soul, and it is, then vigilant citizens will do everything in their power to throw off the shackles of the therapeutic state by abolishing psychiatry along with its abhorrent collaborators. If we wish to continue to live and act as free and responsible citizens, psychiatry, the science of lies, must be exposed for what it is. The myth of mental illness must be overturned. The therapeutic state must be conquered. The false philosophies that undergird psychiatry must be annihilated, or else the hydra will grow new heads. Until that time, psychiatrists will continue to masquerade as healers who treat the human soul with medicine. Until that time, masses of innocent men, women, and children will continue to suffer because of the deceptions of the science of lies, the illusions of the myth of mental illness, and the tyranny of the therapeutic state." So that was my essay that I submitted to Mad in America, the website, and it was rejected by Robert Whitaker, and maybe not directly by Robert Whitaker, but at least the editors or whoever it is in charge just decided for whatever reason that they couldn't publish it, even though they publish numerous articles on from people like Bonnie Burstow, who was an abolitionist. Another great author on Mad in America that I should tell you about is, let me think of his name. It's another one of these names. There's a book that I forgot about last time. It's escaping my memory right now, but I'll mention him in future videos because there is one author on Robert Whitaker's blog, Mad in America, who really gets it more than I think anyone else. So that's my essay, and I just like to kind of give a little try to help you understand a little bit what it's like, what goes on with psychiatric torture. Like, as I've tried to define, this is what psychiatry says it is, but what is it actually? As I try to define what is psychiatry, a common phrase that I use is psychiatry is a pseudoscientific system of slavery that masquerades as a medical profession. But I'd like to just give you a sense of what goes on in a psychiatric ward. What happens to these victims of psychiatry? Why is it so terrible? It's impossible to describe in words the suffering that people endure under the dominion of psychiatry. It's impossible to describe the suffering caused by the psychotropic drugs, and it's also impossible to describe the suffering caused by the torture, the involuntary incarceration, what people often referred to as hospitalization, um, and the other forms of psychological torture that take place. So I've just thought of a few movies that could maybe give you a picture of maybe what people might feel like um, in a in the setting of a psychiatric torture chamber. So one movie to keep in mind is A Beautiful Mind. Maybe you've seen the story of John Nash, I believe that's his name, the mathematician who was captured by psychiatrists. There's a scene where he's assaulted and dragged off to the torture chamber, um, the mental hospital. There's there's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a few scenes from there, medication time, the therapy scene. Those will give you a glimpse into the reality, and even though it's a movie, those are very accurate portrayals of what goes on in the psychiatric torture chambers. A little more imaginative, I have here Han Solo tortured by Darth Vader and stormtroopers. So remember Han Solo getting tortured. That will give you a little glimpse into it. I love Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. So Frodo, when Frodo is being attacked and stung by the spider Shelob, that's a good reminder of psychiatry, because the venomous sting of the spider is perhaps a good image to evoke what happens when psychiatrists forcibly drug their victims. 1984, George Orwell's book. There was a movie made out of it. If you remember the How Many Fingers scene, or The Vision of the Future, or Room 101, those torture scenes can help you understand what people go through sometimes when they're involuntarily incarcerated, or even when they voluntarily go to the psychiatric torture chamber thinking that it's a hospital, thinking that these are real doctors that will help them and heal them. They still may undergo these forms of torture. The Matrix, you remember the belly button torture, the little weird thing that goes into his belly button and all that. These are kind of, dark and frightening scenes, but one of my favorite movies of all time, The Princess Bride. You remember the machine? He was stretched out on that rack, and you could hear throughout all the village, throughout all the forests, the groans of Wesley as he was on the machine. And if you've seen The Dark Crystal, there's the podlings when they're being drained of their essence. I think that's a good way of thinking about what happens to people in psychiatry. And finally, I put on here Braveheart, because the end when he cries out freedom, freedom. That just makes me think of probably what a lot of victims of psychiatry are thinking or crying out in their hearts as they're being tortured. So those maybe can help you understand, if you haven't gone through something like this yourself, or if known someone who has. Those are some movies, some scenes that may help you to understand why psychiatry is, as Thomas Szasz said, it's the science of lies. So, and I also wrote a poem about this to maybe increase your understanding of what it's like. So this poem is called A Christmas Eve Visit to the Psychiatrist. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the hospital not a creature was stirring, not a single committal. IVs were hung by the bedsides with care, in hopes that more patients soon would be there. The children were suffering in the wing for pediatrics, while the elderly hallucinated in the wing for geriatrics. Psych techs in their scrubs and Bob his straight jacket had just simmered down from a terrible racket, when out in the hallway there arose such a clatter I sprang from the toilet to see what was the matter. Away to the ruckus I flew like a torpedo, tore open the door like a move in Aikido. I slipped and I slid on the dirty tile floor, then I switched on the lights so that I could see more, when what to my sleep-deprived eyes should appear but a hunched-over figure quivering with fear. The nurses drew near and gave him a kick. I knew in a moment they thought he was sick. The psychiatrists rapidly gathered like jackals. They hoisted him onto a gurney with shackles. Schizophrenia, bipolar, he's crazy, he's manic. Even depressed patients started to panic. Lithium, Effexor, Haldol, Zyprexa, Klonopin, Geodone, Depakote, and Celexa. Hold down his torso, it's time for a twinge. Hold down his legs, get out the syringe. Force him down, pin him down, no need to wheedle. Pull down his pants and insert the needle. As a crow with his beak pecking into the ground when there's a worm or an insect under a mound, so into his buttock the liquid was injected. It worked even better than the nurses expected, and then in an instant I heard the man shout, "What are you doing? Please let me out." His eyes filled with tears, his anguish was evident, but the medical crew only grew more malevolent. The man writhed in pain, his torment complete, as the chemicals spread to his head and his feet. He twisted and turned, still flat on his back, and he looked like a victim on a medieval rack. His eyes, how they twitched, his lips, how they trembled. He fell to the ground while the nurses assembled. A psychiatrist wrote on his prescription paper, "Give him some Xanax and don't let him taper." They dragged him away to a dark, dingy room, and he sat there to rot like a corpse in a tomb. What had he done to deserve such a beating? What did the doctors decide in their meeting? The diagnosis is clear. This man's mental illness, a psychiatrist's voice could be heard in the stillness, is code 296 in the DSM-5. That is, of course, if he's still alive. The nurses agreed and the staff was convinced, while the man in his room whimpered and winced. 2 hours went by, then 3, then 4. The psychiatrist thought he should stay for one more. Then on the next day, when we were released, he looked like a man turning into a beast. His eyes were glazed over, his hands how they shuddered. He staggered when walking, when talking he muttered. His words were all jumbled, his speech was chaotic, and soon after that the man went psychotic. So on Christmas morning, when you sit by the tree, opening presents with gladness and glee, remember this man whose life was so vexed. Don't let down your guard, because you could be next. And then I said, have a safe, psychiatry-free Merry Christmas. So that's just a little creative portrayal of what goes on and what psychiatry does to innocent human beings. The next portion of this video I'd like to talk about, so the title I said was Psychiatry, Celebrities, and SSRI Stories. So sometimes celebrities can help us understand a little bit about psychiatry, because there have actually been so many of them who have been harmed or even killed by psychiatry. So there's a few that I'd like to focus on specifically. Marilyn Monroe, Carrie Fisher, Robin Williams. And then there's a website that I like to recommend that has a collection of over 6,000 stories of what it's called SSRI stories. So if you go to ssristories.org, you can see this compilation of antidepressant nightmares. And there's even a section on celebrities. So this list of celebrities whose lives have been in one way or another ruined or damaged by psychiatry includes people like Sinead O'Connor, Prince, Mariah Carey, Tom Petty, Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries, Frank Sinatra, Kanye West, Justin Bieber, Junior Seau, Heath Ledger, Adam Ant, Lindsay Lohan, Britney Spears, Phil Hartman. And also I have some things I like to share from Tom Cruise, because he has some interesting ideas about psychiatry as well. But let me start with Marilyn Monroe. So I was very interested to learn about that. I had never known that Marilyn Monroe was actually a victim of psychiatry. So I wrote a little blog post about this. The title is "The Monsters That Marred Marilyn Monroe," and um, there's some record of her tragic death and her commitment to a psychiatric ward. And these are her own words that she wrote about the experience. Quote, "There was no empathy at the hospital Payne Whitney. It had a very bad effect. They asked me after putting me in a cell, I meant cement blocks and all, for very disturbed, depressed patients, except I felt I was in some kind of a prison for a crime I hadn't committed. The inhumanity there I found archaic. They asked me why I wasn't happy there. Everything was under lock and key. Things like electric lights, dresser drawers, bathrooms, closets, bars concealed on windows. The doors have windows so patients can be visible all the time. Also, the violence and markings still remain on the walls from former patients." I answered, "Well, I'd have to be nuts if I like it in here. Then they're screaming women in their cells. I mean, they screamed out when life was unbearable, I guess. At times like this, I felt an available psychiatrist should have talked to them." So, and I have a few pictures here of Marilyn Monroe being forcibly incarcerated, manhandled by psychiatrists and psychiatric workers, and I have a picture of her exiting the psychiatric facility, just looking all haggard and just disheveled. Um, then the next day, Marilyn was examined by her psychiatrist, and she wrote, quote, "The nurse came in after the doctor, a psychiatrist, had given me a physical examination, including examining the breasts for lumps. I took exception to this, but not violently, only explaining that the medical doctor who had put me there, a stupid man named Dr. Lipkin, had already done a complete physical less than 30 days before." So then, after 4 horrific days of forced, and then this is me writing, after 4 horrific days of forced baths and coercive treatments, Joe DiMaggio finally rescued her from the psychiatric prison. Marilyn Monroe died of a drug overdose not long after her last therapy session with her psychiatrist, Ralph Greenson. Then I wrote, "Sometimes it takes a celebrity to point out the obvious. Sadly, sometimes those celebrities die as a result of psychiatric abuse." So this is, a revelation to me. I never knew that that's what was the cause of Marilyn Monroe's early demise. If you're Star Wars fans, I've already mentioned Han Solo, and do you remember Carrie Fisher? She was also a victim of psychiatry. I have a blog post about this. Carrie Fisher, victim of psychiatry. You can find it on my blog. I have some other people listed here. Brooke Shields, Robin Williams, other victims of psychiatry. Robin Williams, Whitney Houston. Oh, Whitney Houston. I love Whitney Houston. I just love watching her videos, her singing. She's just amazing. And when I learn about what psychiatry is doing to these amazing people, I don't like it at all, to put it mildly. Michael Jackson, Prince, Heath Ledger, so forth and so on. Carrie Fisher, the beloved Princess Leia of Star Wars fame, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at age 29. This led her on the roller coaster of psychotropic drugging and psychiatric incarceration that would eventually cause her premature death at age 60. Like many celebrities, she was duped into becoming an advocate for the psychopharmaceutical industrial complex that caused her demise. Like many who are deceived by psychiatry and big pharma, she embraced the myth of mental illness and the chemical imbalance hoax. Like many good people, she wholeheartedly believed that she was mentally ill and that psychiatry could help her. Little did she know that psychiatry is actually the science of lies. It may sound outrageous to claim that mental illness is a myth, that chemical imbalances are a hoax, and that psychiatry is the science of lies. Nevertheless, it is true. Anyone who understands the real history of psychiatry will readily grasp the truth of these concepts. Dear Carrie Fisher, may God rest your soul. So, her early demise was also a direct or indirect result of psychiatry, psychotropic drugging, and so forth. Do you remember Robin Williams? great actor in many great movies. He's in Dead Poet Society, so there's some interesting criticisms of that movie. I mean, I enjoyed it when I was younger, but some of the critiques that I've read about it, I think, are actually good. But still, doesn't detract from the reality, the fact that he was a great actor and a you know, very charismatic person. Um, but in his movie, The Dead Poets Society, there's the fictional character who commits suicide, but Robin Williams was a real person who committed suicide. And in my blog post, I write, in the first place, there is much evidence to suggest that Robin Williams' suicide was a direct result of the diagnoses that he received and the drugs that he was prescribed. In other words, Robin Williams' suicide was facilitated by psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry. Actors Marlon Wayans and Rob Schneider both confirm that psychotropic drugs contributed to Robin Williams' tragic death. This is a painful reality that few seem willing to acknowledge, but hopefully everyone will understand when and if the autopsy and toxicology reports are revealed. Unfortunately, the drug-induced suicides are becoming more and more common. So I haven't checked on any of those autopsy or toxicology reports, but I wouldn't be surprised if Marlon Wayans and Rob Schneider were actually telling the truth. There is no patch Adams that can stop these tragedies from occurring because psychotropic drugs cause people to do things that they wouldn't normally do, often provoking them to violence and suicide. The drugs that are supposed to produce relief from symptoms and miraculous awakenings are in reality the very substances that cause painful symptoms and in some cases, such as that of Robin Williams, cause death. Williams himself was only partially aware of the effects of psychotropic drugs, otherwise he might still be alive today. The FDA's black box warning are not sufficient to prevent such tragedies because they obscure the fact that psychotropic drugs inflict terrible damage on the human brain and they allow pharmaceutical companies to continue to market madness. Robin Williams, may he rest in peace, and may psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry that facilitated his death follow suit. So that's a little bit about that. Robin Williams. There are many other celebrities, and as I mentioned on ssristories.org, you can find a whole list of celebrities who have struggled with or been tortured by or even have died because of psychiatry. While I'm mentioning these celebrities, while he's not actually a celebrity, I thought it'd be a good time to remind you of the story of Andreas Lubitz, the Lufthansa Germanwings Flight 99525. Remember this guy who deliberately crashed the 150 passenger Airbus A320 into the French Alps. So when I first saw that story on the news, I immediately thought, oh, this has got to be another psychotropic drug story. So, and lo and behold, it was. So I write in my blog post, The Crash, whatever problems Lubitz was dealing with personally, symptoms of depression, anxiety, vision problems, broken relationships, job stress, etc., they were nothing compared to the brain havoc caused by psychiatry and psychotropic drugging. The toxic chemicals that riddled Lubitz's brain, substances more accurately described as androphonic or man-slaying drugs, included the powerful Zyprexa or olanzapine, which is euphemistically referred as an atypical antipsychotic. So he was on Zyprexa, and I note that he was not the first pilot to crash an aircraft or under the influence of SSRIs. He's not the first subject of psychiatry on psychotropic drugs to commit an egregious act of mass murder and suicide. Thousands of similar tragedies have already been recorded, and there will be many more unless psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies are held accountable for these crimes. And then I list, again, SSRI stories. There's a whole list of those. Similar stories, whether mass shootings, airplanes crashing, just violent acts all of which were caused in some way or form by psychotropic drugs. And this also just, this is not to say that people don't commit heinous crimes without drugs, because obviously they do and people have. It's just to point out that one of the reasons behind this huge increase in mass shootings and other horrible crimes like this is the direct connection to psychiatry. Obviously, not all of them, but a high percentage of them. You'll notice whenever the next story comes out about a mass shooting, just look it up and try to find out what was psychiatry involved, what psychotropic drugs was he taking, did he or she just withdraw from the drugs? All those things are factors, as Peter Breggin has shown in Medication Madness, that these drugs can cause good, normal people to commit heinous crimes. And that's a really, really awful thing. And it's been reported over and over. You know, people who thought, man, this kind and sweet person all of a sudden turns into a raving, rampaging madman. Like, what's going on here? Just look into psychiatry a little bit. So I know in my article on Lubitz that it's most likely a direct result of psychiatric abuse and psychotropic drugging. The drugs that really cause it. Ironically, the mainstream media, so-called medical experts, and the ignorant masses will probably continue to view this tragedy as a result of a mysterious mental illness that should have required more treatment and care. So that's what's so tricky about psychiatry, is whenever one of these stories comes out, when one of these terrible acts of violence, these crimes, that a lot of people start to claim, oh, we need more mental health care, we need better treatment. If these people would have had treatment sooner, this never would have happened. When in reality, the reason why these people are doing these things is because they have been treated by psychiatry. They've been tortured, they've been abused, they've been drugged, they've been involuntarily incarcerated, and sometimes after that, or sometimes after withdrawing rapidly from a drug, never withdraw rapidly from a psychotropic drug. That's a lot of times when these terrible tragedies occur. And I predict that more of these tragedies will occur as psychiatry continues to grow, and as the mental health mongers continue to expand their domain. So those are some stories about psychiatry. I wrote a blog post about Tom Cruise. So here's another celebrity to help us understand psychiatry. Tom Cruise wasn't a victim of psychiatry, but his former wife, I guess it was Brooke Shields, did have encounters with psychiatry. So let me just go through this post a little bit, because Tom Cruise has a little interview with Matt Lauer on June 23rd, 2005 on the Today Show. He discusses the film War of the Worlds, his relationship with Katie Holmes, and Scientology. He talks about psychiatry and defends Brooke Shields. And Cruise takes Lauer to task for his ignorance concerning the history of psychiatry, and he chides him for his irresponsibility. Cruise says, quote, "I know that psychiatry is a pseudoscience." So, you know, and I like some Tom Cruise movies, you know, Mission Impossible and so forth. And obviously his affiliation with, what do you call that? His affiliation with Scientology is unfortunate. But he actually is really smart about psychiatry. He understands it. So I say, what is going on in this interview? Why is Lauer so eager to defend Brooke Shields, and why is Cruise so confident in his position? What does Cruz claim to know that Lauer doesn't, and why does it matter? What is the history of psychiatry, and why is it important to understand this history? Many have tried to dismiss Cruz's position as mere Scientological gobbledygook, but Cruz makes it clear that he opposed psychiatry even before his involvement with Scientology. In addition to his experience with Brooke Shields, Cruz has many good reasons to oppose psychiatry. In fact, one of the world's top psychiatrists subsequently defended Cruz and commended him for his courage. Soon after the interview with Lauer, Dr. Peter Breggin, author of Toxic Psychiatry, Medication Madness, and Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, wrote an article for the Huffington Post to thank Cruz for speaking out against psychiatry. Quote, "Well, Tom, you said on TV things I've been saying in the media and in my books and scientific articles for 3 decades, but boy, did you generate a lot more attention to the issues. Thanks." So even though physicians and researchers such as Peter Breggin and Thomas Szasz and Robert Whitaker have spent decades uncovering the mendacity of the mental health industry, sometimes it takes a celebrity with a little bit of experience to bring truth to light. In spite of his unfortunate involvement with Scientology, and regardless of his success as an actor, Tom Cruise gets at least one thing right. Psychiatry is a pseudoscience. Furthermore, as Cruise also understands, chemical imbalances are a myth. There is no such thing as mental illness. It is all a myth. The world may continue to believe this myth, and as a result, many more will be harmed and even killed, but that's because the world doesn't know the history of psychiatry. It's time for the world to know. So I enjoy that interview with Tom Cruise and Matt Lauer, and just another celebrity who helps to shed light on the truth about psychiatry. So, I think next time I'd like to talk a little bit about. Every episode we can talk about a book by Thomas Szasz because he's written, many, several dozens of books on psychiatry and antipsychiatry, and perhaps we'll get to his book Schizophrenia: The Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry next time, and maybe some other antipsychiatrists that I'd like to introduce to you. But that will suffice for today, and hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Truth About Psychiatry, Psychiatry Celebrities, and SSRI stories. And I will see you soon.